Well, welcome everyone. This is Sarah Munson from Casey Family Programs, and we're so glad that all of you could join us for today's webinar, Nuts and Bolts, Child Welfare Financing 101, which is the first in a three-part series on child welfare funding. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know a few housekeeping elements. We've muted the lines to reduce disruptions because we're going to be recording this webinar to make sure that it's available for those who couldn't join us today. But you're encouraged to pose any questions that you may have throughout our hour together on the Q&A on the Zoom platform. In order to do so, simply select Questions and Answers, type in your question, and hit Send. It's down at the bottom. If you're attending by phone only, feel free to email your questions directly to us at kmresources@casey.org, and we'll be sure to add them to our running list today. We'll be collecting questions throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer them, either immediately or in the Q&A portion at the end. If we don't get to your questions, we'll be sure to answer them in a follow-up document or weave them into sessions 201 and 301, which are forthcoming. And we'll be sure to provide that information about the resources at the end, and we'll be sending the information out after the webinar as well. I know you will be joining me in extending a very warm welcome to our panel of presenters today. Today we have with us Dr. David Sanders, Executive Vice President of Systems Improvement here at Casey Family Programs. We have Joan Smith, Managing Director of SI Services at Casey Family Programs. Don Winstead, Casey Family Programs Consultant. Melissa Jacks, Casey Family Programs Consultant. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Sanders, who's going to share with you the agenda for today and set the stage for the rest of our time together.
Thank you, Sarah. And thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes on the agenda and the purpose of the meeting. So if I were to ask most of you on the line, why are you in this business? My guess is the response would be to help children and families. My guess is the response would also include not to get an MBA in 4E, 4B, TANF, CAPTA, and other child welfare funding streams. Most of us hope somebody else will figure it out and tell us what needs to happen. But if your goal is to help children and families, funding is a critical tool. So today's session is the first in a three-part series designed to demystify child welfare funding streams. It's intended to be educational and informational, and to cover the history, the current context of funding, existing funding streams, and new opportunities. Again, the history, the current context, existing funding streams, and new opportunities. So why address child welfare financing? First, because we think it's critical to understand the history and current funding landscape of child welfare in order to leverage existing and upcoming opportunities. And second, because as I mentioned, funding is a critical strategic tool to help children and families. It allows us to purchase necessary services, to deploy resources, and to determine our priorities. So those are the agenda and the purpose, and to get into the detail of today's webinar, I'm going to turn it over to Joan Smith.
So I just wanted to comment a little bit on some observations and feedback, both from my experience in the field as well as what we've learned from the waiver jurisdictions that we've been working closely with for the last several years. And the first is that I had a major role, or at least an important role, hopefully I thought it was important, in how we thought about the resources that we had available to us and what we needed both in Hennepin County, Minnesota, and in Los Angeles County, California, around child welfare. And I've said this in the past, but I think you often hear the saying that what gets measured gets done, but I think that there's a precursor to that, and it's what gets paid for gets measured, and then therefore what gets measured gets done is really important. And we'll learn a little bit through this webinar around the history of child welfare financing and how much of that was built onto the 4E system and why that is such a driver, regardless of today what your funding mix might look like. But it still drives so much of how we develop our systems and how we think about our systems. And so I think it's really important to point that out, because I think we struggled at times in both of the places that I work to figure out, how do we do this differently? How do we fund this differently? How do we make the resources available differently than that 4E structure? And it's possible, and there are new opportunities, as we'll talk about today, but I think it's really important to think about kind of what designs a system and kind of the financing underneath it that starts that process. That is really hard to change incrementally at times. And so just want people to be mindful of that as we work through this. The second piece I want to highlight is just some key lessons from the waiver jurisdictions. And so we had, at the end of all of it, we had I'll get this wrong now, 28 jurisdictions that had a waiver, or active in a waiver, and had a lot of learning as a result of all of those jurisdictions being part of waiver, including the ones who were part of it for a period of time and decided not to continue the waiver, which would have brought us up to the total of 31. And some of the key lessons I think that folks brought back from that experience of being part of a waiver is that in order to change financing, it truly has to start with a vision. That has got to be what's driving how you're going to think about those changes in financing to your system and how you're going to utilize new opportunities for financing in your system. And so being able to start from that place versus just what are these dollars for, and then how might I use them or not use them, but kind of what is my vision and where do I want to go with this, and then how does this all fit in is really important. I think the second really big message was, even with all the time, it's been 5 years, I should say 4 years now, with some waivers, some of them have been around for almost 20 years. It always seems like there's never enough time to really gauge the impact. And so we have to be learning organizations and learning communities to be able to figure out how we assess and evaluate and continue to move forward in the unknown and being able to make the changes that we want. I think one of the things that the waivers did allow folks, and what they've identified, is there's a true significance in the alignment with other systems and of partners in this process. And so it's not all about 4E, it's not all about the child welfare, state, local, jurisdictional agency systems, tribal systems. It's about how we bring the partners together to make those connections. And then you can never communicate enough about these kinds of changes that you want to make. And so thinking that through and building upon that was a key lesson from the waivers, as well as that while it's incredibly important to have evidence-based practices and to build them, if we don't have them, those challenges aren't easy. And so you have to have patience and make sure that you give the time and the effort and the resources to be able to develop that. And then I think finally that just, again, that whole idea around being a learning organization and being able to figure this all out in real time and continually is a really important piece of that. And so one of the places that the waivers focused on, not every waiver, but what was key in importance was around things that we weren't able to fund in child welfare prior to being able to have the waiver opportunity. And many of those fell into the prevention services, as well as some of the services that related to being able to serve kids and families in the foster care system. But I think most importantly, the things that we learned helped to inform what came out in the Families First Prevention Services Act. And so there's a lot of things in there that are trying to build off of those learnings, as well as what the field has been saying for a long time. Maybe not everything is exactly the way you want it, but there is a great opportunity with all of it to be able to think about this, but also to think about beyond Families First. What do we really need to do to keep informing and adjusting that financing system, which is truly kind of that building block that kind of what gets paid for gets measured, what gets measured gets done, thinking drives many of our systems. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Dawn to walk you through the plan for today and beyond.
Great. Thanks, Joan. So as Sarah mentioned at the outset, this is the first part of a multi-part series. And today is part one, Child Welfare Financing 101. And we'll cover a little history, and we'll introduce some child welfare funding information and some Title IV-E basics, particularly 4E foster care. Then for Casey Family Programs staff, for leadership staff, there will be some upcoming meetings where we'll have some opportunities to be together in person for the next activities. But for others, we're planning additional webinars, and part two will be key to activities to use your knowledge of child welfare funding and take a deeper look at variations among jurisdictions. And then part 3 will be even deeper, including issues related to transitioning to Family First, either from waiver states and the additional challenges of transitioning from waiver funding, or for non-waiver jurisdictions, the challenges involved in and the opportunities involved in transitioning to Family First. So to begin, a little bit of how we got here, and there's a lot of ways to deal with history. You can start, sometimes when I talk about these issues, I go back to the Elizabethan Poor Laws, but for today's purposes, we'll start a little bit closer in history with the Social Security Act. The Social Security Act is really the foundation of child welfare from a funding perspective. From a non-funding perspective, particularly if you read the history of the Children's Bureau, which is a great read and gives a lot of information, goes back over 100 years and really begins with discussions in the Industrial Revolution. But from a funding perspective, the Social Security Act is key. The key part that is illustrated in the foundation and in the roots of what our child welfare funding is comes from the amendments to the Social Security Act that were enacted on August the 14th, 1935. At that time, there was created Title IV of the Social Security Act, which was then called Aid to Dependent Children, originally funded at $24.75 million. And Title V, Part 3, was Child Welfare Services, originally funded at $1.5 million, which is a pattern that continues to this day, that Child Welfare Services is much less richly funded than some other things. Well, over time, then Title 4A, Aid to Dependent Children, became 4A AFDC, or Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Title 5, Part 3 became the new Title 4B of the Social Security Act, also called Child Welfare Services. When things started, AADC, the maximum payment for a child under the original legislation was $18 for the first child, and 1/3 of that was federal share and 2/3 had to be state share. So as we go through more details, we'll see how that has changed over time. This particular slide takes us up until the late 50s, almost to 1960, and then we'll go beyond that. So in 1960, there was something that became known in the history of child welfare funding as the Louisiana incident. And I need to quickly say, for folks that may be on from Louisiana, I'm not picking on you. It's just that history recorded this as a significant event, but there were many other states where similar incidents were occurring. Louisiana in 1960 expelled 23,000 children from its welfare rolls because it was determined that their homes were not suitable because they had, the moms had born a child outside of marriage. And at that time, the gentleman you see on the slide was Secretary of then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which administered the Aid to Dependent Children program, a gentleman named Arthur Fleming. Dr. Fleming then said no, that he did not think that states ought to be able to do that, and he passed or got enacted emergency rules that became known as the Fleming Rule, and required states to either provide appropriate services to make homes suitable, or if the home was not suitable, to move the child to a suitable placement while continuing to provide financial support on behalf of the child. Next slide. So if you look back over time, in 1960, we had the Fleming Rule. 1961, there were actually several actions by Congress, but essentially Congress said, yes, we agree with what Dr. Fleming did by emergency rule and incorporated into law what was then called the AFDC-FC program, which stood for AFDC for foster care. So at the time, if you were a low-income child in your home, you might be eligible for AFDC, and if the home was not suitable and you were removed from the home, then the funding would come through AFDC-FC for the foster care program. Then in 1980, Title 4E was created, and what was AFDC-FC became 4E foster care. Then in 1996, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act was passed, more broadly known as welfare reform, and AFDC was repealed. And there was a quandary. If AFDC was repealed, at this time, all the eligibility rules for 4E were part of, or because they came from AFDC, and if AFDC was repealed, then what would be the basis for financial eligibility for Title 4E? So Congress, in their wisdom, settled on a date, July 16th, 1996, and said any child who was eligible for AFDC, if their home of removal was eligible for AFDC as of that date, then they would be eligible for Title 4E. Financially. This originally was seen as a protection for children so that there wouldn't be any reduction of that. But that date was locked in, and that's what a lot of people call now the look back. So AFDC was repealed, and that date was locked in. No one would have guessed that that would remain the law of the land until today, but it is. So AFDC was repealed, and the ghost of AFDC remains. And you will see the ghost of AFDC remaining for a good long time. So we're going to transition now to the child welfare funding sources. And before we go into the specific funding sources, start with the Social Security Act. And this slide just gives you the overview of the Social Security Act. And I show this for one particular reason. Every once in a while, when Joan and Melissa and I do versions of this training, we'll have someone who will say, wait a minute, 4E of what? And the answer is 4E of the Social Security Act, specifically Title 4, and then we'll see Part E. So there are 21 titles to the Social Security Act. Title 4 is grants to states for aid and services to needy families with children and for child welfare services. You'll see there are 3 other titles of the Social Security Act that we've highlighted just because of their significance for child welfare. Title 19, of course, is Medicaid, and Title 20 is Social Services Block Grant, and both Medicaid and Social Services Block Grant are important for child welfare. I've also highlighted Title 11 there because the funding authority and the statutory authority for child welfare demonstration waivers are part of Title 11, Section 1130. The next slide shows just the portions of Title 4E, and there are different parts, A, B, C, D, E, and F, cleverly. And Part A is TANF, used to be AFDC. Part B is Child Welfare, Child and Family Services, that includes Child Welfare Services and Safe and Stable, and we'll see that in just a minute. Part C used to be the old Work Incentive or WIN program and is now repealed. Part D is Child Support and Establishment of Paternity. And Part E, you'll see, has undergone a change. That is a change from the Family First Prevention Services Act, where it is now called Federal Payments for Foster Care, Prevention, and Permanency. and that's as of February of this year. Part F, it was formerly the Job Opportunity and Basic Skills Training Program that was connected to AFDC, and it was repealed when TANF was created. So now I'm going to, as we go into, I'm going to transition, and Joan is going to pick up and go over more specifically the child welfare funding sources.
And so, building on what Don has said, one of the first places for funding, which is more restrictive and limited, is the Title IV-B funding. And of course, that's split into two subparts. Subpart 1, which is the Stephanie Tubbs Jones Child Welfare Services Program from 1935, and subpart 2 is the Promoting Safe and Stable Families. And for subpart 1, the combination of the both of them amounts to a little over 5% of total funding. So again, it's a small portion of the total funding, but has more of the flexibility and less restrictions than some of the things under 4E, just not a lot of the dollars. The Stephanie Tubbs Jones Child Welfare Services Program is a formula that is a grant that's given to states, territories, and tribes for child welfare services. And the primary uses for it are to protect and promote the welfare of children, to prevent the neglect, abuse, or exploitation of children, to support at-risk families through the services which allow children, where appropriate, to remain with their families, or to be returned in a timely manner, and to promote the safety, permanency, and well-being of children in foster care and adoptive families, and to provide training and professional development and support to ensure a well-qualified workforce. Again, not a lot of dollars, but focus on a lot of the things that folks feel are extremely important to being able to best serve families and achieve the best outcomes. For Part B, Subpart 2, Promoting Safe and Stable Families, which came around in 1993, again is a formula grants to states, territories, and tribes in 4 categories, which are family preservation, family support, time-limited family reunification, and adoption, promotion, and support. Some of the things that have been further identified as it relates to 4B Subpart 2 is some targeted amounts of dollars to be for improved caseworker visits, to improve outcomes for children affected by substance abuse, to help provide funding for the court improvement program, and to do some of the research, training, and technical assistance. So again, a lot of the things that folks see as really important, but not a lot of the dollars devoted to the system. But if that is not a lot of the dollars, CAPTA is even smaller, and that was established in 1974 and is probably, I believe, less than 1% of the total child welfare funding. And then, of course, the majority of funding is the Title IV-E, which primarily focuses on the care for children that have entered into the foster care system. So foster care, adoption assistance, guardian assistance, and the CHAFE funding for youth transitioning to adulthood in the system. So if you can go to the next slide. The non-dedicated funds, so these are funds that, those first sets of funds were things that are solely dedicated to child welfare. These are funds that are obviously broader than child welfare, but you can use some portion of them for child welfare depending upon the regulations around that. So there is the temporary assistance to needy families that allows for you to use some portion of the funding for TANF to be able to serve families in the child welfare system as long as they meet the eligibility requirements for TANF in terms of the family definition and needs of the family. The most least restrictive and most flexible, I guess would be the best way to put it, funding source is the Social Services Block Grant, and that's a set amount that is established by Congress in terms of the amount of dollars available that states can use for a wide variety of uses, including child welfare, but certainly not solely dedicated to child welfare. There is a portion of Medicaid that can be used for particular targeted case management and rehabilitative services that can be used for child welfare services in a fairly restrictive manner, but is still available in addition to the health funding, which we're not addressing, but the health funding for kids and families that qualify for Medicaid, whether they're in or not in the child welfare system. There's also the Social Security dollars, as well as the Social Security dependent dollars for where the parent has died. That is a very small portion of funding. And then everything else that falls beyond that is all of the state and local funding that meets the needs for child welfare, that goes beyond the matching requirements for all of the other funding sources that have been described here. If you can go to the next slide, please. And so just want to give you a picture of how this looks across the country. Folks, I think, tend to think of 4E as a major funding stream, which it is. And if you look at this from the 2014, this is from the Child Trends survey, where all of the jurisdictions across the country responded to and provided your information to help inform the slide here. Shows you how the dollars are being spent, the federal dollars are being spent in child welfare across the nation. This has changed somewhat for the 2016 survey that you most recently responded to, and you should be seeing the results of that survey this fall, as the information that you provided will be finalized and put out in a document that's done every 2 years. But you will see that there have been some increases and decreases overall in each of those categories, as well as increases for child welfare spending, but not at any significant rate. So while they may change from every 2 years, these percentages, there's not significant changes that we've seen in any of these over the last 10 years at least. So, and in fact, the actual amount of federal dollars over the last 10 years has been declining. So if you go to the next slide, please. We wanted to give you a sense about the federal child welfare spending. So how do states use it? So that last slide was a really nice picture of how everybody looks when we're all put together. But how we look separately is really different. And so how folks use these funding sources and to what extent, and the decisions that they make around that, is what we're trying to depict here in the child welfare, the federal child welfare spending, about how states are using it. And we just picked a few states to be able to identify what this looks like. But it's important to note. So if you look at, and I'm not picking on states of whether this is good or bad, I'm just pointing out the differences. Is if you compare Ohio to Michigan, it's quite a difference in how much 4E versus other funds are used. And there are a lot of things that will influence that within a state. The local environment, the risk aversion or risk tolerance in a state, how the legislators in that state view the funding sources, how the other systems that you're accessing, including TANF, SSBG, Medicaid, all of those things, how their plans have been developed, all of those play really important into how these differences appear. And so again, with TANF, if you look at Wisconsin versus Texas, again, a very big difference, and you can go on and on. But it's really important to note that I think, as Don has always said, that knowing how child welfare funding works in one system is just that, knowing how it works in one system, because it doesn't apply across the country to every system. It's very different and very diverse. And so learning from each other about what we're doing and how to best utilize the existing resources is really important. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And then this just shows you a picture of how things have changed over time as it relates to the federal dollars versus state and local dollars. And in 2014, I think based upon both how waivers were being recorded as part of the survey, among other things about how states had looked at their local and state mix, the folks that do the survey, Child Trends, decided to combine local and state all together. So that's why you see the 16.3 as one number, where you've seen it broken out in the other years, as it was getting more and more difficult to make those distinctions. But if you add them all together, it does show you a changing federal and state picture about how child welfare is financed overall across the country. Next slide. So one of the things we want to start with in this webinar is to talk about the federal funds and what piece of the puzzle that is. So it's important. It drives so much what the federal government chooses to fund, and many of the things that we do fall behind that because there are matching requirements, there's efforts, there's all kinds of things that happen with that. But there are a lot of state and local dollars in the game, and I think that's an important point to make. So if we can go to the next slide. It's important to keep in mind how much state dollars are in the game. And so where as I started, the two places I had responsibility for this area, Minnesota and California and major counties, it was very different in terms of what that state and local spending mix was, but it was also I also was the beneficiary of being able to have more than just the match dollars or the maintenance of efforts dollars that were required, and that there was an investment made in each of those states or counties that allowed us to have some flexibility beyond what was required from the federal government sources, which helped us to think a little bit more broadly about how we spent our dollars and where we invested. But that's very different in every state, and so it's really important to for states to take a look at where they're at and what flexibility you do have to be able to build on that. And I think, Don, I know that you had some thoughts around this particular piece also, and so if you wanted to expand on the thinking around that state local funding, that would be great.
Well, I think the key thing is, there are a lot of factors that go into it, and as we build on this in future webinars and future sessions, we'll go into a lot of detail of what drives this. But as Joan says, there's an awful lot of variation. If you look, for example, at West Virginia versus Pennsylvania, these are two states that are they even have a common border. But very, very different in terms of their dependency on federal funds, their commitment of state and local funds, so that you see a very different picture. And if you go to the next slide, these are some common factors that help explain, at least in part, those differences in terms of the non-federal, which would include both state and local funds that are used in child welfare. As I say, we'll go through in more detail in later sessions on each one of these, but some of those include the states, and FMAP stands for Federal Medical Assistance Percentage. And this is the federal matching rate that is used for foster care maintenance payments and adoption assistance payments and guardianship assistance payments, and it is the same matching rate that's used in the Medicaid program. We'll even in later sessions, we'll teach you how to calculate that with the warning, spoiler alert, it involves the use of square roots. But you don't have to do that because everybody's got smartphones that'll do that for them. Penetration rate. Penetration rate is an often discussed and sometimes not well understood factor. This is the percentage of your administrative costs that you can charge to 4E administration in foster care, adoption assistance, and guardianship assistance. We talked earlier about the 1996 AFDC standard of need, and we'll, on a later slide in this presentation, give you a picture of what that looks like. Caseload composition can vary by location among counties and among states. Some of that has to do with just the demography of the state. Some has to do with your child welfare laws and how you're structured, et cetera. The array of services is an important factor, plus state decisions to commit funds beyond the minimums required for matching fund or maintenance of effort requirements. So all of those are going to be factors that influence the amounts of state and local funds. We'll start taking a closer look now at some of the basics of the child welfare requirements, and particularly Title 4E, which, as Joan went over, is the largest funding source, and particularly related to 4E foster care. We're going to ask Melissa Jocks, who will take us through some of the basics there. Melissa?
All right. So to be eligible for Title 4E, an expenditure has to be made on behalf of an eligible child in an eligible placement. So how do we define eligible child? It's a child who meets certain removal and placement standards or is considered to be a candidate and whose family would have been eligible for AFDC on July 16th, 1996. There's that ghost again. And what is an eligible setting for non-candidates? Licensed family foster homes or licensed child care institutions. So let's dive into the removal and placement standards a little more on the next slide. But again, these don't apply to foster care candidates. We'll discuss a little bit more detail about candidacy later. The placement must be established via a voluntary placement agreement entered into by a parent or legal guardian. This is less common than what most of us are familiar with, which is a judicial determination that continuation in the home from which the child was removed would be contrary to the welfare of the child and that reasonable efforts have been made to prevent removal. You all are probably very familiar with these phrases. Any of you who have participated in any kind of 4E audit know that those terms are very, very important to documenting 4E eligibility. So on the next slide, we're going to review some of the placement and care requirements. Specifically, placement and care has to be the responsibility of the state 4E agency or another public agency with which the 4E agency has an agreement, or a tribal organization or consortium with an approved 4E plan. Also, the child has to be placed in a family foster home or a licensed child care institution. FFPSA added another category of placement for children, that is children placed with parents in family-based residential substance abuse facilities. It's important to remember that placement and care does not mean custody. A major responsibility in placement and care is the development of the case plan and the periodic review of the appropriateness and suitability of the plan and of the foster care placement to ensure that proper care and services are provided to facilitate return to the child's own home or make an alternative permanent placement. Responsibility for placement and care is generally associated with child custody. Child custody of the child is not a requirement of federal law or policy under Title 4E. So the next slide has some more specific definitions related to placement and care. Foster care is really a broad term for 24-hour substitute care for children placed away from their parents or guardians, and it includes several types of placements that we're all familiar with: family foster homes of relatives, group homes, shelters, residential facilities, child care institutions, and pre-adoptive homes. This definition exists independent of whether the facility is licensed and whether the state is making payments. Now, as Don mentioned earlier, he's going to give you some more information on the AFDC needs standard on the next slide.
Okay, and as we transition to this, one of the things that we'll come back to again and again and again as we have later sessions that becomes very important for the Family First Prevention Services Act and prevention services is the stuff that Melissa just went over on placement and care. That's going to be a very important concept. So that's one that just put a placeholder there. We'll come back to that in subsequent sessions. We talked about the 1996 AFDC needs standards, and a couple of things to note there. First of all is this chart now, unless your eyes are very, very good, it's hard to read the states, but this shows all the states and shows approximately where states were in 1996. The Congressional Research Service actually did a telephone survey of all states in 1996 and asked them what their needs standard was, because, you know, the internet capability was a little bit less than it is now. And they put together this chart, which was published in the 1996 House Ways and Means Green Book. And if you're not familiar with the Green Book, this is a document that the staff of the House Ways and Means Committee, along with the Congressional Research Service, completes every 2 years, and it is a treasure trove of information about all the programs under the jurisdiction of the Ways and Means Committee. This shows all the different need standards, and you see some things that are not really obvious in terms of what you might expect. Based on history and AFDC payment levels, you would largely expect to see southern states near the bottom and northern and upper Midwestern states near the top. But you see some differences. Who would have thought that Iowa would be higher than California, or Alabama would be higher than Michigan or New York on this? And it's based on the need standard, which is different from the payment standard. And I'm not going to go deeply into those differences because you'd have to be an AFDC aficionado to really care about that. But this is what's driving part of the limitation that people are having with penetration rate and their foster care funding. You can see Pennsylvania, which is highlighted in yellow, is about the median state there. And I've shown for California, just as an illustration, what this number is, or what it's called in state parlance, may vary from place to place. In California, it's called a California Minimum Basic Standard of Adequate Care that was published and shows those amounts. But this is something that is a limiting factor. It is set in law and it cannot change. It does not get updated for cost of living or for inflation. It is set in law and it would take an act of Congress to change it. Next slide. This shows just the funding categories for how states in broad categories report their foster care funding to the federal government. And each of these are largely different because of different match rates. The demonstration funding is until October 1st of 2019. And of course, the funding categories will be expanded under the Family First legislation. So to briefly go over each of those, I'll turn it back to Melissa.
Remember that foster care maintenance, and go ahead and next slide. Foster care maintenance is reimbursed for eligible children in eligible settings. It is a specific reimbursement tied exactly to that child in that setting. In addition to those requirements, maintenance can include only specific categories of cost, generally thought of as room, board, and supervision. For institutional settings, the cost can include the reasonable cost of operation and administration of the institution. And for those of you who are familiar with the Child Welfare Policy Manual, there are lots and lots of detailed questions as to what can and cannot be included in maintenance. Maintenance is reimbursed at a state's FMAP. And on the next slide, we will see that foster care administration is reimbursed at 50% after applying the penetration rate. And remember that foster care administration is generally based on some fairly sophisticated cost allocation procedures. And in one of the later trainings, we're going to talk more about cost allocation. We think of administration in general as case management, but it also includes eligibility determination, which are reimbursed at 50-50 with no penetration, provider management and agency management, and you can think about other functions as licensing and placement staff as 4E administration as well. And as mentioned earlier, 4E admin is also allowable for candidates, meaning in-home case management for that population. One of the great things about FFPSA is that for those children considered to be prevention candidates, 4E admin is claimable without application of AFDC financial eligibility, which basically means there's no penetration rate. And also note that even though FFPSA limited maintenance reimbursement after 14 days for non-family foster homes, 4E admin is still claimable on those children. However, on the next slide, it's so important, we just quoted it directly. Allowable administrative costs do not include the cost of social services provided to the child's family, or foster family, which provide counseling or treatment to ameliorate or remedy personal problems, behaviors, or home conditions. But again, FFPSA has changed the landscape in that it's opened the door for some specific prevention services for candidates, which could be considered to be social services. So let's discuss candidacy a little bit more on the next slide. The key phrase here is imminent risk of removal from the home, as long as reasonable efforts are being made to prevent the need for removal. A redetermination is required every 6 months to ensure that the child remains at imminent risk. Interestingly, FFPSA used slightly different language for candidates, referring to candidates as those at imminent risk of entry or re-entry into foster care, but the concept is the same. Don is going to give you a national perspective now on candidacy claiming.
Okay, so clearly one of the things that is critically important as jurisdictions contemplate moving forward to Family First in implementation is going to be candidacy, because candidacy is basically the doorway through which access to funding for prevention services goes. So to be eligible for prevention services, you have to either be a pregnant or parenting foster child, or you have to be a candidate. In getting ready for candidacy, this map shows past candidacy claiming. Now, if anybody disagrees with the color there, I must tell you, I made this up, so let me know what you think color you ought, what you ought to be, and I'll be glad to change it. But what I did, I went back and looked at prior candidacy claiming and looked at how much of administrative claiming was for in-placement administration versus pre-placement or candidacy administration. And states that did a lot of candidacy claiming relative to in-placement, I did bright blue, and ones that were average or better in that, I did a darker blue, less than average, a darker red, and little or no candidacy claiming in history, I did bright red. Now, first of all, there is no political significance to these colors, as you can see. I tried a version of this that was red and green, and it just looked too Christmassy for July. So these are the colors. My key point here is that if your state is either bright red or darker red, then, and if you're responsible for claiming in systems, you really need to look very closely at your past claiming and whether or not your systems are set up with the capacity to effectively claim candidacy. If you're dark blue or bright blue, then that's probably an indicator that your past candidacy claiming indicates that you've got the systemic capacity for that claiming. But if you do not have good systems in place for candidacy claiming, then you've got, until you implement prevention services, which would be October 1, 2019 or later, to really pay close attention to that in order to be able to maximize your ability to provide prevention services and get federal reimbursement for that. The next slide shows the part of the Social Security Act, part of 4E, Title 4E, Section 474 is the section of the Act that talks about payments to states, and it goes through in about 8 pages of detail, what I've synthesized here on one page. This says you get foster care maintenance payments through FMAP and adoption assistance, et cetera. So prior to Family First, there were 5 subsections to Section 474 covering through kinship guardianship. The ones shown in green are the amendments, 2 things of significance there. First of all, as early as October 1, 2019, prevention services are available for 50% funding for services if those services meet all the Family First criteria, which is largely for candidates and are trauma-informed and are supported, well-supported, or promising practices, and prevention services administration and training, which is 50%. And that is not subject to penetration rate. And for most jurisdictions, 50% pure without penetration rate is better than 50% or even 75% subject to penetration rate under normal training reimbursement. For prevention, expenditures have to be claimed under subsection 6, either as services or administration and training, not under the traditional parts of the Social Security Act. The other is kinship navigator expenditures. Those are also eligible for 50% federal reimbursement without penetration rate, that is, without the AFDC eligibility requirement. That is effective October 1st of this year for evidence-based kinship navigator services. So with that, I'm going to transition back to Joan for any summary comments and moving towards conclusion. Thanks.
So in the spirit of making sure we have time for some question and answer, Sarah, I'm going to just go directly to you so that we can get to some of the questions that folks have had on this, so we can try to start to address them.
Great. Thanks so much, Don and Melissa and Joan and David. We really appreciate that overview. Now we're going to take some time for questions that we've received. Justin, do you want to start with some of those that we received in advance?
Yeah, so I'll read one here. This is, how are reasonable efforts, findings in courts connected to agency funding? How are those findings enforced by the feds?
Okay. Generally, well, I'll start off, and then Joan and David and Melissa jump in with additional things. I mean, there are the Children's Bureau does eligibility reviews, 4E eligibility reviews periodically, and reviewers come in, select a sample of cases, and review them, and they have a checklist, and the checklist goes through and has all the requirements, and reasonable efforts is one of those. So they will look at the court orders, they will look in the system of record, which normally is going to be the SACWA system, whatever, and see if those reasonable efforts are documented and if there's been a court finding to that effect. And if so, then you get a yes check mark, and if not, then that's a no, and the 4E funding associated with that case would be disallowed. And if it's a widespread issue, they can apply that statistically to your overall claims, and you would face potentially a penalty in your 4E funding.
Thank you. Another question here is, in what ways can data be used to increase opportunities for funding?
I think that, again, I'll start that generally, I mean, the funding authorization is going to come out of Congress. Most of it comes through the House Ways and Means Committee on the House side and the Senate Finance Committee on the Senate side. And of course, the state decisions about funding levels are made by state legislatures and in county operated systems by county commissions or county supervisors. So those are decisions made, and in each of those venues, there's a lot of gathering of information. HHS and the Children's Bureau does reports to Congress on all sorts of data and that come out of the data systems. So, you know, the data informs the appropriation process that yields to funding imperfectly, but that's basically the way it works. Joan, Melissa, David, any additional thoughts here? Melissa is shaking her head.
All right, well, there's a couple other questions that are coming in now, too. So here's a couple that are actually sound related. Is there a short way to explain penetration rates again? And will we have access to the PowerPoint? And then one that I think that's related is, what is the relationship between FMAP and penetration rate?
Great questions. Penetration rate, the simplest way to explain it, and there's a simple, easy way to explain it and a bit more complicated. I'll go simple and easy. If you count all the children for whom a 4E foster care payment is made, and you add to that some children that are 4E eligible that a payment's not being made, they may be on a trial home visit, or they may be getting SSI in lieu of maintenance payment. But you take all the children who are 4E eligible and getting either a maintenance payment or a 4E funded administration expense related, divide that by all the children for whom a maintenance payment is being made or administration from any funding source. So it's essentially 4E children divided by all children is the penetration rate. It varies considerably. The lowest penetration rates among states in the country are in the teens, and the highest penetration rates are in the low 70s in terms of percentages. And we'll get in later sessions a lot of the why that is. In terms of the relationship to FMAP, my sense is there's not really as much as you would think. Over time, penetration rate is going to erode nationally because of the loss of the inflation effect on the 1996 standards. But when you look state to state, that's one of the interesting dynamics is you don't see a high correlation between penetration rate and FMAP.
So another question we have is, can we get reasonable effort and/or best interests from a verbal authorization or from a checkbox added to an officer's report?
I mean, typically you're going to, reasonable efforts are going to be documented in the case file, documented in the system of record, and the court is going to review those and affirm in court findings that are reasonable efforts. So, so it is, when the reviewers come in, they're going to want to see evidence in the system of record documenting reasonable efforts.
And then we've also had some questions, just some housekeeping things that, like, yes, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sharing that out afterwards. And also we will be sharing the PowerPoint as well.
Justin, if I can just, this is Joan, if I can just add a couple of points of context from all of the things that have been said, hopefully maybe as a way to wrap this up. I think one of the things we talk a lot about is how much or how little financing changes across the system. And so while you don't see major swings in shift of financing between federal financing and state financing, or necessarily in a lot of the funding sources, when there is a big change in how we think about the policy around child welfare, you do start to see some bigger shifts. And so I just want to bring to people's attention, while these results are preliminary because the Child Trends is still finalizing your responses to the survey, what we know so far about what states have reported in spending in 2016 from 2014, I think has some significance. And so I just wanted to make folks aware of that. So the federal Title 40 foster care program expenditures from 2014, state fiscal year 2014 to state fiscal year 2016 decreased by 10%. So you saw a decrease, and that includes maintenance payments, administration, training, and SACWIS. So you're seeing, we saw a decrease in the overall investment in Title 40 foster care programming. For the adoption assistance program under 4E, we saw an increase of about 7% during that same time. And so that's, so that would be something you'd want to see if they're down in the foster care, up in adoption. And I think this is the one that's the most important, that says how policy can change, how spending changes. The Title 40 guardianship assistance program had a much larger increase. Now remember, the amount was small to begin with, very small, so any increase would be big. But an increase of 45% from 2014 to 2016 about the expenditures in states that were happening as it related to guardianship, I think reflects a policy change from a previous time for, under the, and I'm totally blanking on the law, but the law that allowed for guardianship to happen and for 4E payments to be made for guardianship. So I just want to keep focused on that idea of how you develop policy and then where you spend your dollars is really important, because kind of at the end of the day, what you fund is going to get measured, and that's going to get done. And I think, well, it took a while for that uptake in guardianship. It is starting to show a much bigger change in terms of how we're thinking about our systems and how we best serve children and families.
Thank you so much, Joan, and Don, and Melissa, and David. That's all the time we have for today. We want to thank everyone for such an incredible turnout in your engagement and questions. As we said, we'll be sending out the PowerPoint as well as the recording, and we'll compile any remaining questions that came in, either share responses through email or make sure that we address in some of the subsequent sessions in this series. So be on the lookout for a follow-up email with all of that information. We're, again, so glad you could be with us today, and we look forward to connecting with you on future sessions. Have a good evening.